Hey guys, I'm gonna try to read these like 24, 26 pages, whatever that we have. Um, it it's gonna mess up a lot. I'm gonna mess up a lot. That being said, we begin on page 762. The Great Depression. The economic collapse altered American attitudes. In the 1920s, optimism had prevailed as people looked forward to an ever-increasing flow of consumer goods and a better way of life. But after 1929, despair set in. Factories closed, machines fell silent, and millions upon millions of people walked the streets looking for jobs that did not exist. The Great Bull Market. The consumer goods revolution contained the seeds of its own collapse. The steady expansion of the automobile and appliance industries had led gradually to a saturation of the market. Each year after 1924, the rate of increase in the sale of cars, refrigerators, and ranges slowed, a natural consequence as more and more people already owned these durable goods. Production began to falter, and in 1927, the nation underwent a mild recession. The sale of durable goods declined, and constructions of houses and buildings fell slightly. If corporate leaders had heeded these warnings, they might have responded by raising wages or lowering prices, both effective ways to stimulate purchasing power and sustain the consumer goods revolution. Or, if government officials had recognized the danger signals and forced a halt in installment buying and slowed bank loans, the nation might have experienced a sharp but brief recession. Neither government nor business leaders were so far-sighted. The Federal Reserve Board lowered the discount rate, charging banks less for loans in an attempt to stimulate the economy. Much of this additional credit, however, went not into solid investment in factories and machinery, but instead into the stock market, touching off a new wave of speculation that obscured the growing economic slowdown and ensured a far greater crash to come. Individuals with excess cash began to invest heavily in the stock market, betting the already impressive rise in security prices would bring them an even greater windfall profit. The market had advanced in spurts during the decade. The value of all stocks listed on the New York Stock Exchange rose from $27 billion in 1925 to $67 billion in early 1929. The strongest surge began in the spring of 1928 when investors ignored the declining production figures in the belief they could make a killing in the market. People bet their savings on speculative stocks. Corporations used their large cash reserves to supply money to brokers who in turn loaned it to investors on margin. In 1929, for example, the Standard Oil Company of New Jersey loaned out $69 million a day in this fashion. Investors could now play the market on credit, buying stock listed at $100 a share with $10 down and $90 on margin. The brokers loaned for the balance. If the stock advanced to $150, the investor could sell and reap a gain of 500% on the $10 investment. And in the bull market climate of the 1920s, everyone was sure the market would go up. By 1929, it seemed the whole nation was engaged in speculation. In city after city, brokers opened branch offices, each complete with a stock ticker and a huge board covered with the latest Wall Street quotations. People crowded into the customer rooms in the offices, filling seats and greeting the latest advances of their public stocks with shouts of approval. So great was the public's interest in the stock market that newspapers carried the stock averages on their front pages. In reality, though, more people were spectators than speculators. Fewer than 3 million Americans owned stock in 1929, and only about 500,000 were active buyers and sellers. But the bull market became a national obsession, assuring everyone that the economy was healthy and preventing any serious analysis of its underlying flaws. When the market soared to more than $80 billion in total value by midsummer, the Wall Street Journal discounted any possibility of decline, proclaiming, "The outlook for the fall months seems brighter than at any time." The great crash in October 1929 put a sudden and tragic end to the speculative mania. The false confidence that had kept the economy from collapsing in 1927 evaporated overnight. Suddenly, corporations and financial institutions were no longer willing to provide capital for stock market purchases. More important, investors and bankers cut off consumer credit as well, drying up buying power and leading to a sharp decline in the sales of consumer goods. Factories began to cut production, laying off some workers and reducing hours for others. The layoffs and cutbacks lowered purchasing power even further, so fewer people bought cars and appliances. More factory layoffs resulted, and some plants closed entirely, leading to the availability of even less money for the purchase of consumer goods. This downward economic spiral continued for 4 years. By 1932, unemployment had swelled to 25% of the workforce. Steel production was down to 12% of capacity, and the vast assembly lines in Detroit produced only a trickle of cars each day. The gross national product fell to 67% of the 1929 level. The bright promise of mass production had ended in a nightmare. The basic explanation of the Great Depression lies in the fact that U.S. factories produced more goods than the American people could consume. The problem was not that the market for such product was fully saturated. In 1929, there were still millions of Americans who did not own cars or radios or refrigerators, but many of them could not afford these new products. There were other contributing causes: unstable economic conditions in Europe, the agricultural decline since 1919, corporate mismanagement, and excessive speculation. But it all came down to the fact that people did not have enough money to buy the consumer products coming off the assembly lines. Installment helped bridge the gap, but by 1929, the burden of debt was just too great. The new economic system had failed to distribute wealth more broadly. Too much money had gone into profits, dividends, and industrial expansion, and not enough had gone into the hands of workers, who were also consumers. Factory productivity had increased 43% during the decade, but the wages of industrial workers had gone up only 11%. If the billions that went into the stock market speculation had been used to increase wages, which would have then increased consumer purchasing power, production and consumption could have been brought into balance. Yet it is too much to expect that the prophets of the new era could have foreseen this flaw and corrected it. They were pioneering a new industrial system, and only out of bitter experience of the Depression would they discover the full dynamics of the consumer goods economy. Effect of the Depression. It is difficult to measure the human cost of the Great Depression. The material hardships were bad enough. Men and women lived in lean-tos made of scrap wood and metal, and families went without meat and fresh vegetables for months, existing on a diet of soup and beans. The psychological burden was even greater. Americans suffered through year after year of grinding poverty with no let-up in sight. The unemployed stood in line for hours waiting for relief checks. Veterans sold apples or pencils on street corners, their manhood, once prized so highly by the nation, now in question. People left the city for the countryside but found no salvation on the farm. Crops rotted in the fields because prices were too low to make harvesting worthwhile. Sheriffs fended off angry crowds as banks foreclosed long-due mortgages on once prosperous farms. Few escaped the suffering. African Americans who had left the poverty of the rural South for factory jobs in the North were among the first to be laid off. Mexican immigrants who had flowed in to replace European immigrants met with competition from an angry citizen now willing to do stoop labor in the fields and work as track layers on the railroads. Immigration officials used technicalities to halt the flow across the Rio Grande and even reverse it. Nearly 500,000 Mexicans were deported in the 1930s, including families with children born in the United States. The poor, black, brown, and white, survived because they knew better than most Americans how to exist in poverty. They stayed in bed in cold weather, both to keep warm and to avoid unnecessary burning of calories. They patched their shoes with pieces of rubber from discarded tires, heated only the kitchens of their homes, and ate scraps of food that others would reject. The middle class, which had always lived with high expectations, was hard hit. Professionals and white-collar workers refused to ask for charity even while their families went without food. One New York dentist and his wife turned on the gas and left a note saying, "We want to get out of the way before we are forced to accept relief money." People who fell behind in their mortgage payments lost their homes and faced eviction when they could not pay the rent. Healthcare declined. Middle-class people stopped going to doctors and dentists regularly, unable to make the required cash payment in advance for services rendered. Even the well-to-do were affected, giving up many of their former luxuries and weighted down with guilt as they watched former friends and business associates join the ranks of the impoverished. "My father lost everything in the Depression," became an all too familiar refrain among young people who dropped out of college. Many Americans sought escape and movement. Men, boys, and some women rode the rails in search of jobs, hoping freights to move south in the winter or west in the summer. Hopping. Men, boys, and women rode the rails in search of jobs, hopping freights to move south in the winter or west in the summer. My apologies. On the Missouri Pacific alone, the number of vagrants increased from just over 13,000 in 1929 to nearly 200,000 in 1931. One town in the Southwest hired special police to keep vagrants from leaving the boxcars. Those who became tramps had to keep on the move, but they did find a sense of community in the hobo jungles that sprang up along the major railroad routes. Here, the unfortunate could find a place to sleep, eat, and people with whom to share their misery. Lewis Banks, a black veteran, told interviewer Studs Terkel what these informal camps were like. Black and white, it didn't make any difference who you were, 'cause everybody was poor. All friendly, sleep in a jungle. We used to take a big pot and cook food. Cabbage, meat, and beans all together. We all sat together. We made a tent. 25 or 30 would be out on the side of the rail, white and colored. They didn't have no mothers or sisters. They didn't have no home. They were dirty. They had overalls on. They didn't have no food. They didn't have anything. I am sorry for whatever that was. Fighting the Depression. The Great Depression presented an enormous challenge for American political leadership. The inability of Republicans to overcome the economic catastrophe provided Democrats with a chance to regain power. Although they failed to achieve full recovery before the outbreak of World War II, the Democrats did succeed in alleviating some of the suffering and establishing political dominance. Hoover and voluntarism. Herbert Hoover was the Depression's most prominent victim. When the economic downturn began in late 1929, he tried to rally the nation with bold forecasts of better days ahead. His repeated assertion that prosperity was just around the corner bred cynicism and mistrust. Expressing complete faith in the American economic system, Hoover blamed the Depression on foreign causes, especially unstable European banks. The president rejected proposals for bold government action and relied on voluntary cooperation within businesses to halt the slide. He called the leaders of the industry to the White House and secured their agreement to maintain prices and wage at high levels. Yet, within a few months, employers were reducing wages and cutting prices in desperate effort to survive. Hoover also believed in voluntary efforts to relieve the human suffering brought about by the Depression. He called on private charities and local governments to help feed and clothe those in need. But when these sources were exhausted, he rejected all requests for direct federal relief, asserting that such handouts would undermine the character of American citizens. As the Depression deepened, Hoover reluctantly began to move voluntarism to undertake more sweeping government measures. A new federal farm board loaned money to aid cooperatives and bought up surplus crops in the open market in a vain effort to raise farm prices. At Hoover's request, Congress cut taxes in an attempt to restore public confidence and adopted a federal public works project, such as Hoover Dam, to provide jobs for idle men, also known as Boulder Dam. To help imperiled banks and insurance companies, Hoover proposed the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, also known as the RFC, which Congress established in early 1932. The RFC loaned government money to financial institutions to save them from bankruptcy. Hoover's critics, however, pointed out that while he favored aid to businesses, he still opposed measures such as direct relief and massive public works that would help the millions of unemployed. By 1932, Hoover's efforts to overcome the Depression had clearly failed. The Democrats had gained control of the House of Representatives in the 1930 elections and were pressing the president to take his bolder action, but Hoover stubbornly resisted. His public image suffered its sharpest blow in the summer of 1932 when he ordered General Douglas MacArthur to clear out the Bonus Army. This ragged group of some 22,000 World War I veterans had come to Washington in the summer of 1932 to lobby Congress to pay immediately a bonus for military service that was due in 1945. After the Senate rejected the bonus bill, some of the veterans stayed in Washington, living in ramshackle huts in Anacostia Flats along the Potomac, as a river. Mounted troops drove the bonus army out of the Capitol, blinding the veterans with tear gas and burning their shacks. Meanwhile, the nation's banking structure approached collapse. Bank failures rose steadily in 1931 and 1932 as customers responded to the rumors of bankruptcy by rushing to withdraw their deposits. The bank crisis completed the nation's disenchantment with Hoover. People were ready for a new leader in the White House. The emergence of Roosevelt. The man who stepped forward to meet this national need was Franklin D. Roosevelt. Born into old Dutch colonial aristocracy of New York, FDR was a distant cousin of the Republican Teddy. He grew up with all the advantages of wealth: private tutors, his own sailboat, his own pony, frequent trips to Europe, and education at Groton and Harvard. His strong-willed mother smoothed all the obstacles in the path of her only child and gave him a priceless sense of inner security. After graduation from Harvard, he briefly attended law school but left to plunge into politics. He served in the New York legislature and went to Washington as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Wilson, a post he filled capably during World War I. Defeated as the Democratic vice presidential candidate in 1920, Roosevelt had just begun a banking career when he suffered an attack of polio in 1921. Paralyzed permanently in both legs, Roosevelt refused to give in to this disability, and with the help of his wife and a few loyal aides, he re-entered politics and was elected the governor of New York in 1928. Political realities required that the use of elaborate deceptions to hide his physical disability, but Roosevelt turned his physical weakness into a personal strength. Roosevelt's dominant trait was the ability to persuade and convince other people. He possessed a marvelous voice, deep and rich, a winning smile, and a buoyant confidence that he could easily transmit to others. Some believed he was too vain and superficial as a young man, but his bout with polio gave him both an understanding of human suffering and a broad political appeal as a man who faced heavy odds and overcame them. He understood the give and take of politics, knew how to use flattery to win over doubters, and was especially effective in exploiting the media, whether in bantering with the newspaper reporters or reaching out to the American people on the radio. Although his mind was quick and agile, he had little patience with philosophical nuisances. He dealt with the appearance of issues, not their deeper substance, and he displayed a flexibility towards political principles that often dismayed even his warmest admirers. Roosevelt took advantage of the opportunity offered by the Depression. With the Republicans' discredit, he cultivated the two wings of the divided Democrats, appealing to both the traditionalists from the South and West and the new urban elements in the North. After winning the party's nomination in 1932, he broke the tradition by flying to Chicago and accepting in person, telling the cheering delegates, I pledge myself to a New Deal for the American people." That was my Roosevelt voice. In the fall, he defeated Herbert Hoover in a near landslide for the Democrats. Roosevelt tallied 472 electoral votes as he swept the South and West and carried nearly all the large industrial states as well. Farmers and workers, Protestants and Catholics, immigrants and native-born rallied behind the new leader who promised to restore prosperity. Roosevelt not only met the challenge of the Depression, but also solidified the shift to the Democratic Party and created an enduring coalition that would dominate American politics for half a century. The 100 Days. When Franklin Roosevelt took the oath of office on March 4th, 1933, the nation's economy was on the brink of collapse. Unemployment stood at nearly 13 million, one-fourth of the labor force. Banks were closed in 38 states. On inauguration morning, the governors of New York and Illinois closed the banks in the nation's two largest cities, thus bringing the country's financial transactions to a halt. Speaking from the steps of the Capitol, FDR declared boldly, "First of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror." Then he announced he would call Congress into special session and request broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency, as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. Within the next 10 days, Roosevelt won his first great New Deal victory by saving the nation's banks. On March 4th, he issued a decree closing the banks and called Congress back into session. His aides drafted new banking legislation and presented it to Congress on March 9th. A few hours later, both houses passed it, and FDR signed the new legislation that evening. The measure provided for government supervision and aid to the banks. Strong ones would be reopened with federal support, weak ones closed, and those in difficulty bolstered by government loans. On March 12th, FDR addressed the nation by radio in the first of his fireside chats. In personal, conversational, and reassuring tones, he told the public what he had done. Some banks would begin to reopen the next day, with the government standing behind them. Other banks, once they became solvent, would open later, and the American people could safely put their money back into these institutions. The next day, March 13th, the nation's largest and strongest banks opened their doors. At the end of the day, customers had deposited more cash than they withdrew. The crisis was over. Gradually, other banks opened, and the runs and failures ceased. Capitalism was saved in 8 days, boasted one of Roosevelt's advisors. Most surprising was the conservative nature of FDR's actions. Instead of nationalizing the banks, he had simply thrown the government's resources behind them and preserved private ownership. Though some other New Deal measures would be more radical, Roosevelt set a tone in the banking crisis. He was out to reform and restore the American economic system, not change it drastically. He drew on the progressive tradition and experience with World War I mobilization to fashion a moderate program of government action. For the next 3 months, until it adjourned in June, Congress responded to a series of presidential initiatives. During these 100 days, Roosevelt sent 15 major requests to Congress and received back 15 pieces of legislation. A few created permanent agencies that have become a part of American life. The Tennessee Valley Authority, also known as the TVA, proved to be the most successful and enduring of all of Roosevelt's New Deal measures. This innovative effort at regional planning resulted in the building of a series of dams in 7 states along the Tennessee River to control floods, ease navigation, and produce electricity. This last feature created cheap and abundant power that helped transform the poverty-stricken Upper South into a relatively prosperous industrial area. Other New Deal agencies were temporary in nature, designed to meet the specific economic problems of the Depression. None were completely successful. The Depression would continue for another 6 years, immune to even Roosevelt's magic. But psychologically, the nation turned the corner in the spring of 1933. Under FDR, the government seemed to be responding to the economic crisis, enabling people for the first time since 1929 to look to the future with hope. 2 major New Deal programs launched the 100 days and were aimed... Two major New Deal programs launched during the 100 days were aimed at industrial and agricultural recovery. The first was the National Recovery Administration, known as the NRA. FDR's attempts to achieve economic advance through planning and cooperation among government, businesses, and labor. In the midst of the Depression, business owners were intent on stabilizing production and raising prices for their goods. Labor leaders were unequally determined to spread work through the maximum hours and put a floor under workers' income with minimum wages. The National Recovery Administration hoped to achieve both goals by permitting companies in each major industry to cooperate in writing codes of fair competition that would set realistic limits on production, allocate percentages to individual producers, and set firm guidelines for prices. Section 7A of the Enabling Act mandated protection for labor in all the codes by establishing maximum hours, minimum wages, and the guarantee of collective bargaining by unions. No company should be compelled to join, but the New Deal sought complete participation by appealing to patriotism. Each firm that took part could display a blue eagle and stamp the symbol on its products. With energetic Hugh Johnson in charge, the NRA quickly enrolled the nation's leading companies and unions. By the summer of 1933, more than 500 industries had adopted codes that covered 2.5 million workers. The NRA quickly bogged down in huge bureaucratic morass. The codes proved to be too detailed to enforce easily. Written by the largest companies, the rules favored big businesses at the expense of smaller competitors. Labor quickly became disenchanted with Section 7A. The minimum wages were often near starvation level, while business avoided the requirement for collective bargaining by creating company unions that did not represent the real needs of workers. After a brief upsurge in the spring of 1933, industrial production began to sag as disillusionment with the NRA grew. By 1934, more and more business owners were complaining about the new agency, calling it the National Runaround. When the Supreme Court finally invalidated the NRA in 1935 on constitutional grounds, few mourned its demise. The idea of trying to overcome the Depression by relying on voluntary cooperation between competing businesses and labor leaders had collapsed in the face of individual interest and greed. The New Deal's attempt at farm recovery fared little better. My bad. The New Deal's attempt at farm recovery fared a little better. Henry A. Wallace, FDR's Secretary of Agriculture, came up with an answer to the farmers' old dilemma of overproduction. The government would act as a clearinghouse for producers of major crops, arranging for them to set production limits for wheat, cotton, corn, and other leading crops. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the AAA, created by Congress in May 1933, would allocate acreage among individual farmers, encouraging them to take land out of production by paying them subsidies. Unfortunately, Wallace preferred not to wait until 1934 planting season to implement this program, and so farmers were paid in 1933 to plow under crops they had already planted and to kill livestock they were raising. Faced with the problem of hunger in the midst of plenty, the New Deal seemed to respond by destroying the plenty. The AAA program worked better in 1934 and 1935 as land removed from production led to smaller harvests and rising farm prices. Farm income rose for the first time since World War I, increasing from $2 billion in 1933 to $5 billion by 1935. Severe weather, especially Dust Bowl conditions on the Great Plains, contributed to the crop limitation program, but most of the gain in farm income came from the subsidy payments rather than from higher market prices. On the whole, large farmers benefited most from the program. Possessing the capital to buy machinery and fertilizer, they were able to farm more efficiently than before on fewer acres of land. Small farmers, tenants, and sharecroppers did not fare as well, receiving very little of the government payments and often being driven off of the land as the owners took the acreage previously cultivated by tenants and sharecroppers out of production. Some 3 million people left the land in the 1930s, crowding into the cities where they swelled the relief rolls. In the long run, the New Deal reforms improved the efficiency of American agriculture, but at a real human cost. The Supreme Court eventually found the AAA unconstitutional in 1936, but Congress reenacted it in modified form that year and again in 1938. The system of allotments, now financed directly by the government, became a standard feature of the farm economy. Other New Deal efforts to assist the rural poor, notably the Farm Security Administration, the FSA, sought to loan money to tenants and sharecroppers so they could acquire land of their own, but the sums appropriated by Congress were too modest. The FSA was able to extend loans to fewer than 2% of the nation's tenant farmers. Obviously, the FSA director informed Roosevelt, this program can be regarded as only an experimental approach to farm tenancy problems. The result of the New Deal for American farming was to hasten its transformation into a business in which only the efficient and well-capitalized would thrive. Roosevelt and relief. The New Deal was far more successful in meeting the most immediate problem of the 1930s. Relief for the millions of unemployed and destitute citizens. Roosevelt never shared Hoover's distaste for direct federal support. On May 12, 1933, in response to FDR's March request, Congress authorized the RFC to distribute $500 million to the states to help individuals and families in need. Roosevelt brought in Harry Hopkins to direct the relief program. A former social worker who seemed to be live on coffee and cigarettes, Hopkins set up a desk in the hallway of the RFC building and proceeded to spend more than $5 million in less than 2 hours. By the end of 1933, Hopkins had cut through red tape to distribute money to nearly one-sixth of the American people. The relief payments were modest in size, but they enabled millions to avoid starvation and stay out of humiliating breadlines. Another, more imaginative early effort was the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, which was Roosevelt's own idea. The Civilian Conservation Corps enrolled youth from city families on relief and sent them to the nation's parks and recreation areas to build trails and improve public facilities. Ultimately, more than 2 million young people served in the CCC, contributing both to their families' incomes and to the nation's welfare. Hopkins realized the need to do more than just keep the people alive, and he soon became an advocate of work relief. Hopkins argued that the government should put the jobless to work, not just to encourage self-respect, but also to enable them to earn enough to purchase consumer goods and thus stimulate the entire economy. A Public Works Administration, PWA, headed by Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes, had been authorized in 1933, but Ickes, intent on the quality of the projects rather than human needs, failed to put many people to work. In the fall of 1933, Roosevelt created the Civil Works Administration, the CWA, and charged Hopkins with getting people off of the unemployment lines and relief rolls and back to work. Hopkins had more than 4 million men and women at work by January 1934, building roads, schools, playgrounds, and athletic fields. Many of the workers were unskilled, and some of the products were shoddy, but CWA at least enabled people to work and earn enough money to survive the winter. Roosevelt, appalled at the huge expenditures involved, shut down the CWA in 1934 and forced Hopkins to return to federal relief payments as the only source of aid to the jobless. The final commitment to the idea of work relief came in 1935 when Roosevelt established the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, to spend nearly $5 billion authorized by Congress for emergency relief. The WPA, under Hopkins, put the unemployed on the federal payroll so they could earn enough to meet their basic needs and help stimulate the stagnant economy. Conservatives complained that the WPA amounted to nothing more than hiring the jobless to do make-work tasks with no real value, what critics called boondoggle. But Hopkins cared less about what was accomplished than helping those who had been unemployed for years to get off the dole and gain self-respect by working again. In addition to funding the usual construction and skills of conservation products, the WPA tried to preserve the skills of American artists, actors, and writers. The Federal Theater Project produced plays, circuses, and puppet shows that enabled entertainers to practice their crafts and perform before people who often had never seen a professional production before. Similar projects for writers and artists led to a series of valuable state guidebooks and to murals that adorned public buildings across the land. A separate National Youth Administration, the NYA, found part-time jobs for young people still in school and developed projects, ranging from automobile repairing in New York City to erecting tuberculosis isolation units in Arizona for 2.5 million young adults. The WPA helped ease the burden of unemployed, but it failed to overcome the Depression. Rather than spending too much, as his critics charged, Roosevelt's greatest failure was not spending enough. The WPA never employed at any one time more than 3 million of the 10 million jobless. The wages, although larger than the relief payments, were still pitifully low, averaging $52 a month. Thus, the WPA failed to prime American economy by increasing consumer purchasing power. Factories remained closed and machinery idle because the American people still did not have the money, either from the relief or the WPA, to buy cars, radios, appliances, and other consumer goods that had been the basis for the prosperity of the 1920s. By responding to basic human needs, Roosevelt had made the Depression bearable. The New Deal's failure, however, to go beyond relief to achieve prosperity led to a growing frustration and appearance of more radical alternatives that challenged the conservative nature of the New Deal and forced FDR to shift to the left. Hold on. We have a lot left. 13 pages left. Alright, this is the end of the first half. Okay, we will begin again on page 773 at Roosevelt and Reform. Hi, welcome back. We begin on page 773. Roosevelt and Reform. In 1935, the focus of the New Deal shifted from relief and recovery to reform. During his first 2 years in office, FDR had concentrated on fighting the Depression by shoring up the sagging American economy. Only a few new agencies, notably TVA, sought to make a permanent change to national life. Roosevelt was developing a broker state concept of government, responding to pressures from organized elements such as corporations, labor unions, and farm groups, while ignoring the needs and wants of the dispossessed who had no clear political voice. The early New Deal tried to assist bankers and industrialists, large farmers, and members of the labor unions, but it did little to help unskilled workers and sharecroppers. The continuing depression and high unemployment began to build pressure for more sweeping changes. Roosevelt faced the choice of either providing more radical programs, once designed to end historical inequities in American life, or deferring to others who put forth solutions in the nation's ills. Bolstered by impressive Democratic victory in the 1934 congressional elections, Roosevelt responded by embracing a reform program that marked the climax of the New Deal. Angry voices. The signs of discontent were visible everywhere by 1935. In the upper Midwest, progressives and agrarian radicals, led by Minnesota Governor Floyd Olson, were calling for government action to raise farm and labor income. "I am a radical in the sense that I want a definite change in the system," Olson declared. "I am not satisfied with patching." Upton Sinclair, the muckraking novelist, nearly won the governorship of California in 1934, running on the slogan, "End Poverty in California," while in the East, a violent strike in the textile industry shut down plants in 20 states. The most serious challenge to Roosevelt's leadership, however, came from three demagogues who captured national attention in the mid-1930s. The first was Father Charles Coughlin, a Roman Catholic priest from Detroit who originally supported FDR. Speaking to a rapt nationwide radio audience in his rich, melodious voice, Coughlin appealed the discontent. Speaking to a rapt nationwide radio audience in his rich, melodious voice, Coughlin appealed to the discontented with a strange mixture of crank monetary schemes and anti-Semitism. He broke with the New Deal in 1934, denouncing it as the pagan deal, and founded his own National Union for Social Justice. Increasingly vitriolic, he called for monetary inflation and nationalization of the banking system in his weekly radio sermons to an audience of more than 30 million. A more benign but equally threatening figure appeared in California. Francis Townsend, a 67-year-old physician, came forward in 1934 with a scheme to assist the elderly who were suffering greatly during the Depression. The Townsend Plan proposed giving everyone over the age of 60 a monthly pension of $200 with the proviso that it must be spent within 30 days. Although designed less as an old age pension plan than as a way to stimulate the economy, the proposal understandably had its greatest appeal among the elderly. They embraced it as a holy cause, joining Townsend clubs across the country. Despite the criticism from economists that the plan would transfer more than half the national income to less than 10% of the population, more than 10 million people signed petitions endorsing the Townsend Plan, and few politicians dared oppose it. The third voice was the third new voice of protest was that of Huey Long, the flamboyant senator from Louisiana. Like Coughlin, an original supporter of the New Deal, Long turned against FDR and by 1935 had become a major political threat to the president. A shrewd, ruthless, yet witty man, Long had a remarkable ability to mock those in power. The Kingfish, a nickname borrowed from Andean Amos, announced a nationwide Share the Wealth movement in 1934. He spoke grandly of taking from the rich to make every man a king, guaranteeing each American a home worth $5,000 and an annual income of $2,500. To finance the plan, Long advocated seizing all fortunes of more than $5 million and levying a tax of 100% on incomes greater than $1 million. By 1935, Long claimed to have founded 27,000 Share the Wealth clubs and had a mailing list of more than 7 million people, including workers, farmers, college professors, and even bank presidents. Threatening to run as a third-party candidate in 1936, Long generated fear among Democratic leaders that he might possibly attract 3 to 4 million votes, possibly enough to swing the election to the Republicans. Although an assassin killed Huey Long in Louisiana in late 1935, his popularity showed the need for the New Deal to do more than help those still in distress. Social Security. When the new Congress met in 1935, Roosevelt was ready to support a series of reform measures designed to take the edge off national dissent. The recent elections had increased Democratic congressional strength significantly, with the Republicans losing 13 seats in the House and retaining less than one-third of the Senate. Many of the Democrats were to the left of Roosevelt, favoring increasing spending and more sweeping federal programs. Quote, coming up, "Boys, this is our hour," exulted Harry Hopkins. "We've got to get everything we want, now or never." Congress quickly appropriated $4.8 billion for the WPA and was prepared to enact virtually any proposal that Roosevelt offered. The most significant reform enacted in 1935 was the Social Security Act. The Townsend movement had reminded Americans that the United States, alone among modern industrial nations, had never developed a welfare system to aid the aged, the disabled, and the unemployed. A cabinet committee began studying the problem in 1934, and President Roosevelt sent its recommendations to Congress the following January. The proposed legislation had three major parts. First, it provided for old age pensions financed equally by tax on employers and workers without government contributions. In addition, it gave states federal matching funds to provide modest pensions for the destitute elderly. Second, it set up a system of unemployment compensation on a federal-state basis, with employers paying a payroll tax and each state setting benefit levels and administering the program locally. Finally, third, it provided for direct federal grants to the states on a matching basis for welfare payments to the blind, handicapped, needy elderly, and dependent children. Although there was criticism from conservatives who mourned the passing of traditional American reliance on self-help and individualism, the chief objections came from those who argued that the administration's measure did not go far enough. Democratic leaders, however, defeated efforts to incorporate Townsend's proposal for $200 monthly pensions and increases in unemployment benefits. Congress then passed the Social Security Act by overwhelming margins. Critics began to point out its shortcomings, as they have ever since. The old age pensions were paltry. Designed to begin in 1942, they ranged from $10 to $85 a month. Not everyone was covered. Those who needed protection in their old age, such as farmers and domestic servants, were not included. the regressive feature of the act was even worse. All participants, regardless of income or economic status, paid in the same rate, with no supplement from the general revenue. The trust fund also took out of circulation money that was desperately needed to stimulate the economy in the 1930s. Other portions of the act were equally open to question. The cumbersome employment system offered no aid to those currently out of work, only to people who would lose their jobs in the future, and the benefits ranged from barely adequate to substandard. The outright grants to the handicapped and dependent children were minute in terms of the need. In New York City, for example, a blind person received only $5 a week in 1937. The conservative nature of the legislation reflected Roosevelt's own fiscal orthodoxy, but even more, it was a product of the political realism. Despite the severity of the Depression, he realized that establishing a system of federal welfare went against deeply rooted American convictions. He insisted on a tax on participants to give those involved in the pension plan a vested interest in Social Security. He wanted them to feel they had earned their pensions, and in the future, no one would dare take them away. "With those taxes in there," he exclaimed privately, "no damned politician can ever scrap my Social Security program." Above all, FDR succeeded in establishing the principle of government responsibility for the aged, the handicapped, and the unemployed. Whatever the defects of the legislation, Social Security stood as a landmark of the New Deal, creating a system to provide welfare for the individuals in a complex industrial society. Labor legislation. The other major reform achievement in 1935 was the passage of the National Labor Relations Act. Senator Robert Wagner of New York introduced legislation in 1934 to outlaw company unions and other unfair labor practices in order to ensure collective bargaining for unions. FDR, who had little knowledge of labor management relations and apparently little interest in them, opposed the bill. In 1935, however, Wagner began to gather broad support for his measure, which passed the Senate in May with only 12 opposing votes, and the President, seeing the passage as likely, gave it his approval. The bill moved quickly through the House, and Roosevelt signed it into law in July. The Wagner Act, as it became known, created a National Labor Relations Board to preside over labor management relations and enable unions to engage in collective bargaining with federal support. The act outlawed a variety of union-busting tactics, and its key provision decreed that whenever the majority of a company's workers voted for a union to represent them, management would be compelled to negotiate with the union on all matters of wages, hours, and working conditions. With this unprecedented government sanction, labor unions could now recruit at large a number of unorganized workers throughout the country. The Wagner Act, the most far-reaching of all New Deal measures, led to the revitalization of all American labor movement and a permanent change in labor management relations. 3 years later, Congress passed a second law that had a lasting impact on all American workers, the Fair Labor Standards Act. A long-sought goal of the New Deal, this measure aimed to establish both minimum wages and maximum hours of work per week. Since labor unions were usually able to negotiate adequate levels of pay and work for their members, the act was only aimed at unorganized workers and met with only grudging support from unions. Southern conservatives opposed it strongly, both on ideological grounds and because it threatened the low Southern wages that had attracted Northern industry since Reconstruction. Roosevelt finally succeeded in winning passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, but only at the cost of exempting many key industries from its coverage. The act provided for a minimum wage of 40 cents an hour by 1940 and a standard work week of 40 hours, with time and a half for overtime. Despite its loopholes, the legislation did not lead to pay raises for the 12 million workers earning less than 40 cents an hour. It did. Despite its loopholes, the legislation did lead to pay raises for the 12 million workers earning less than 40 cents per hour. My bad. More important, like Social Security, it set up a system, however inadequate, that Congress could build on the future to reach more generous and humane levels. Other New Deal reform measures met with a mixed reception in Congress. Proposals to break up the huge public utility holding companies created by promoters in the 1920s and to levy a soak-the-rich tax on the wealthy stirred up bitter debate, and these bills were passed only in greatly weakened form. Roosevelt was successful in passing a banking act that made important reforms in the Federal Reserve System. He also gained congressional approval of the Rural Electrification Administration, which helped bring electricity to the 90% of American farms that still did not have it in the 1930s. All in all, Roosevelt's record in reform was similar to that in relief and recovery. Modest success, but no sweeping victory. A cautious and pragmatic leader, FDR moved far enough to the left to overcome the challenges of Coughlin, Townsend, and Long without venturing too far from the mainstream. His reforms improved the quality of life in America significantly, but he made no effort to correct all the nation's social and economic wrongs. Impact of the New Deal. The New Deal had a broad influence on the quality of life in the United States in the 1930s. Government programs reached into areas hitherto untouched. Many of them brought long overdue improvements, but others failed to make any significant dent in historic inequities. The most important government advances came with the dramatic growth of labor unions. The conditions for working women and minorities in non-unionized industries showed no comparable advance. Rise of organized labor. Trade unions were weak at the onset of the Depression, with a membership of fewer than 3 million workers. Most were in the American Federation of Labor, composed of craft unions that served the needs of skilled workers. The nation's basic industries, such as steel and automobiles, were unorganized. The great mass of unskilled workers thus fared poorly in terms of wages and working conditions. Section 7A of the NRA had led to some growth in AFL ranks, but the union's conservative leaders, eager to cooperate with businesses, failed to take full advantage of the opportunity to organize the mass production industries. John L. Lewis, head of the United Mine Workers, took the lead in forming the Committee on Industrial Organization, the CIO, in 1935. The son of a Welsh coal miner, Lewis was a dynamic and ruthless man. He had led the mine workers since 1919 and was determined to spread the benefits of unions throughout industry. Lewis first battled with the leadership of the AFL, and then, after being expelled, he renamed his group the Congress of Industrial Organizations and announced in 1936 that he would use the Wagner Act to extend collective bargaining to the nation's auto and steel industries. Within 5 years, Lewis had scored a remarkable sense of victory. Series of victories. My bad. Some came easily. The big steel companies, led by U.S. Steel, surrendered without a big fight in 1937. Management realized that federal support put the unions in a strong position. There was greater resistance in the automobile industry. When General Motors, the first target, resisted, the newly created United Automobile Workers, the UAW, developed an effective strike technique. In December 1936, GM workers in Flint, Michigan simply sat down in their factory, refusing to leave until the company recognized their union and threatening to destroy the valuable tools and machines if they were removed forcibly. When the Michigan governor refused to call out the National Guard to break the strike, General Motors conceded defeat and signed a contract with the UAW. Chrysler quickly followed suit, but Henry Ford refused to give in and fought the UAW, hiring strikebreakers and beating up organizers. In 1941, Ford finally recognized the UAW. Smaller steel companies, led by Republic Steel, engaged in even more violent resistance. In one incident in 1937, police shot 10 strikers. The companies eventually reached a settlement with the Steel Workers Union in 1941. By the end of the 1930s, the CIO had some 5 million members, slightly more than the AFL. The successes were remarkable. In addition to the automaking and steel unions, organizers for the CIO and the AFL had been successful in the textile, rubber, electrical, and metal industries. For the first time, unskilled as well as skilled were unionized. Women and African Americans benefited from the creation of the CIO, not because the union followed enlightened policies, but simply because they were made up of a substantial proportion of the unskilled workforce that the CIO organized. Yet despite these impressive gains, only 28% of all Americans, excluding farm workers, belonged to unions by 1940s. Millions in restaurant, retail, and service trades remained unorganized, working long hours for very low wages. Employer resistance and traditional hostility to unions blocked further progress, as did the aloof attitude of President Roosevelt, who commented to labor and management, "A plague on both your houses," during the steel strike. The Wagner Act had helped open the way, but labor leaders such as Lewis, Philip Murray, and the Steelworkers Organizing Committee, and Walter Ruth of the United Automobile Workers, deserved most of the credit for union achievements. The New Deal record on help to minorities. The Roosevelt administration's attempts to aid the downtrodden were least effective with African Americans and other racial minorities. The Depression hit blacks with special force. Sharecroppers and tenant farmers had seen the price of cotton drop from 18 to 6 cents a pound, far below the level to sustain a family on the land. In the cities, the saying, "last hired, first fired," proved all too true. By 1933, more than 50% of urban blacks were unemployed. Hard times sharpened racial prejudice. "No jobs for Negroes until every white man has a job," became a rallying cry for many whites in Atlanta. The New Deal helped African Americans survive the Depression, but it never tried to comfort squarely the racial injustice built into the federal relief programs. Although the programs served blacks as well as whites, in the South, the weekly payments blacks received were much smaller. In the early days, NRA codes permitted lower wage scales for blacks, while the AAA led to the eviction of thousands of Negro tenants and sharecroppers. African American leaders referred to the NRA standing for "Negro Robbed Again," and dismissed the AAA as a continuation of the same old raw deal. Nor did later reform measures help very much. Neither the minimum wage nor Social Security covered those working as farmers or domestic servants, categories that comprised 65% of all African American workers. Thus, an NAACP official commented that Social Security looks like a sieve with the holes just large enough for the majority of Negroes to fall through. Despite this bleak record, African Americans rallied behind Roosevelt's leadership, abandoning their historic ties to the Republican Party. In 1936, more than 75% of African Americans who voted supported FDR. In part, this switch came in response to Roosevelt's appointment of a number of prominent African Americans to high-ranking government positions, such as William H. Hastie to the Interior Department and Mary McLeod Bethune in the National Youth Administration. Eleanor Roosevelt spoke out eloquently throughout the decade against racial discrimination, most notably in 1939, when the Daughters of the American Revolution refused to let African American contralto Martin Anderson sing in Constitution Hall. The First Lady and Interior Secretary Harold Ickes arranged for the singer to perform at the Lincoln Memorial, where 75,000 people gathered to hear her on Easter Sunday. Perhaps the most influential factor in the African Americans' political switch was the colorblind policy of Harry Hopkins. He had more than 1 million blacks working for the WPA by 1939, many of them in teaching and artistic positions, as well as in construction jobs. Overall, the New Deal provided assistance to 40% of the nation's blacks, and during the Depression, Overall, the New Deal provided assistance to 40% of the nation's blacks during the Depression. Uneven as his record was, Roosevelt had still done more to aid this oppressed minority than any previous president since Lincoln. One African American newspaper commented that while Relief and WPA are not ideal, they are better than the Hoover breadlines, and they'll have to do until the real thing comes along. The New Deal did far less for Mexican Americans. Engaged primarily in agricultural labor, these people found their wages in California fields dropping from 35 to 14 cents an hour by 1933. The pool of unemployed migrant labor expanded rapidly with Dust Bowl conditions in the Great Plains and the subsequent flight of Okies and Arkies to the cotton fields of Arizona and the truck farms of California. The Roosevelt administration cut off further influx from Mexico by barring entry of any immigrant likely to become a public charge. Local authorities rounded up migrants and shipped them back to Mexico to reduce the welfare rolls. The New Deal relief program did aid many thousands of Mexican Americans in the Southwest in the 1930s, although migrant workers had difficulty meeting state requirements. The WPA hired Mexican Americans for a variety of construction and cultural programs, but after 1937, such employment was denied to aliens. Overall, the pattern was one of great economic hardship and relatively little federal assistance for Mexican Americans. Native Americans, after decades of neglect, fared slightly better under the New Deal. Roosevelt appointed John Collier, Collier, a social worker who championed Indian rights, to serve as Commissioner of Indian Affairs. In 1934, Congress passed the Indian Reorganization Act, a reform measure designed to stress tribal unity and autonomy instead of attempting to transform Indians into self-sufficient farmers by granting them small plots of land. Collier employed more Native Americans in the Indian Bureau, supported educational programs on the reservations, and encouraged tribes to produce native handiwork such as blankets and jewelry. Despite modest gains, however, the nation's 1/3 million Indians remained the most impoverished citizens in America. Women at work. The decade witnessed no significant gain in the status of American women. In the midst of the Depression, there was little concern expressed for protecting or extending their rights. The popular idea that women worked for pin money while men were the breadwinners for their families led employers to discriminate in favor of men when cutting the workforce. Working women are, quote, are holding jobs that rightfully belong to God-intended providers of the household, end quote, declared a Chicago civic group. More than 3/4 of the nation's school boards refused to hire married women, and more than half of them fired women teachers who married. Federal regulations prohibited more than one member of a family from working in the civil service, and almost always it was the wife who had to defer to her husband. A Gallup poll revealed that 82% of the people disapproved of working wives, with 75% of the women agreeing. Many of the working women in the 1930s were either single or the sole supporters of an entire family. Yet their wages remained lower than those for men, and their unemployment rate ran higher than 20% throughout the decade. Women over age 40 found it particularly hard to find jobs during the Depression. The New Deal offered little encouragement. NRA codes sanctioned lower wages for women, permitting laundries, for example, to pay them as little as 14 cents an hour. The minimum wage did not help women employed in industry. My bad. Again. The minimum wage did help those women employed in industry, but too many worked as maids and waitresses, jobs not covered by the law, for the new law to have much overall effect on women's incomes. Despite these hardships, the number of married women and women between the ages of 25 and 40 in the labor force increased during the 1930s. Relatively few women worked in heavy industry where unemployment was greatest. Most were employed in the clerical and service sectors, area of traditional female employment, in which jobs were more plentiful. The one area of advance in the 1930s came in government. Eleanor Roosevelt set an example that encouraged millions of American women. Instead of presiding sedatively over the White House, she traveled continually around the country, always eager to uncover wrongs and bring them to the president's attention. Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor, became the first woman cabinet member, and FDR appointed women ambassadors and federal judges for the first time. Women were elected to office in larger numbers in the 1930s. Hattie W. Caraway of Arkansas succeeded her husband in the Senate, winning a full term in 1934. That same year, voters elected 6 women to the House of Representatives. Public service, however, was one of the few professions open to women. The nation's leading medical and law schools discouraged women from applying, and the percentage of females faculty members in colleges and universities continued to decline in the 1930s. In sum, a decade that was grim for most Americans was especially hard on American women. End of the New Deal. The New Deal reached its high point in 1936 when Roosevelt was overwhelmingly re-elected and the Democratic Party strengthened its hold on Congress. This political triumph was deceptive. In the next 2 years, Roosevelt met with a series of defeats in Congress. Yet, despite the setbacks, he remained a popular political leader who had restored American self-confidence as he strove to meet the challenges of the Depression. Franklin Roosevelt enjoyed his finest political hour in 1936. A man who loved the give and take of politics, FDR faced challenges from both left and right as he sought re-election. Father Coughlin and Gerald L. K. Smith, who inherited Huey Long's following after the senator's assassination in 1935, organized a labor union party, with North Dakota progressive Congressman William Lemke heading the ticket. At the other extreme, a group of wealthy industrialists formed the Liberty League to fight what they saw as the New Deal's assault on property rights. The Liberty League attracted prominent Democrats, including Al Smith, but in 1936 it endorsed the Republican presidential candidate, Governor Alfred M. Landon of Kansas. A moderate, colorless figure, Landon disappointed his backers by refusing to campaign for repeal of popular New Deal reforms. Roosevelt ignored Lemke and the Union Party, focusing attention instead on the assault from the right. Democratic spokesperson condemned the Liberty League as a millionaires' union and reminded the American people of how much Roosevelt had done for them in fighting unemployment and providing relief. In his speeches, FDR condemned the economic royalists, who were unanimous in their hatred for me. I welcome their hatred, he declared, and promised that in his second term these forces would meet their master. This frank appeal to class sympathies proved enormously successful. Roosevelt won easily, receiving 5 million more votes than he had in 1932 and outscoring Landon in the Electoral College by 523 to 8. The Democrats did almost as well in Congress, piling up margins of 331 to 89 in the House and 76 to 16 in the Senate. Equally important, the election marked the stunning success of the new political coalition that would dominate American politics for the next 3 decades. FDR, building on the inroads into Republican majority that Al Smith had begun in 1928, carried urban areas by impressive margins, winning 3.6 million more votes than his opponents in the nation's 12 largest cities. He held on to traditional Democratic votes in the South and West, and added them by appealing strongly to diverse religious and ethnic groups in the northern cities: Catholics and Jews, Italians, Poles, Irish, and Slavs. The strong support of labor, together with 3/4 of the black vote, indicated that the nation's new alignment followed economic as well as cultural lines. The poor and the oppressed, who in the Depression years included many middle-class Americans, became attached to the Democratic Party, leaving the GOP in a minority position, limited to the well-to-do and to rural and small-town Americans of native stock. The Supreme Court fight. FDR proved to be far more adept at winning electoral victories than in achieving his goals in Congress. In 1937, he attempted to use his recent success to overcome one obstacle remaining in his path: the Supreme Court. During his first term, the court had ruled several New Deal programs unconstitutional, most notably the NRA and the AAA. Only 3 of the 9 justices were sympathetic to the need for emergency measures in the midst of the Depression. 2 others were unpredictable, sometimes approving the New Deal measures and sometimes opposing them. 4 justices were bent on using the Constitution to block Roosevelt's proposals. All were elderly men, and one, Willis Van Devanter, had planned to retire in 1932, but remained on the court because he believed Roosevelt to be unfitted and unsafe for the presidency. When Congress convened in 1937, the president offered a startling proposal to overcome the court's threat to the New Deal. Instead of seeking constitutional amendment to either limit the court's power or to clarify the unconstitutional issues, FDR chose an oblique attack. Declaring the court was falling behind schedule because of the new age of its members, he asked Congress to appoint a new justice for each member of the court over the age of 70, up to a maximum of 6. Although this court-packing scheme, as critics quickly dubbed it, was perfectly legal, it outraged not only conservatives but liberals as well, who realized it could set a dangerous precedent for the future. Republicans wisely kept silent, letting prominent Democrats such as Senator Burton Wheeler of Montana lead the fight against Roosevelt's plan. Despite all-out pressure from the White House, resistance in the Senate blocked early action on the proposal. Excuse me. The court deafened itself well. Chief Justice Charles Evan Hughes testified tellingly to the Senate Judiciary Committee, pointing out that in fact the court was held up to date and not behind schedule as Roosevelt charged. The court then surprised observers with a series of new rulings approving such controversial New Deal measures such as the Wagner Act and Social Security. In the midst of the struggle, Justice Van Devanter resigned, enabling FDR to make his first appointment to the court since taking office in 1933. Believing he had proven his point, the president allowed his court-packing plan to die in the Senate. During the next few years, 4 more vacancies occurred, and Roosevelt was able to appoint such distinguished jurists as Hugo Black, William O. Douglas, and Felix Frankfurter to the Supreme Court. Yet the price was high. The court had badly weakened the president's relations with Congress, opening deep rifts with members of his own party. Many senators and representatives who had voted reluctantly for Roosevelt's measures during the depths of the Depression now felt free to oppose any further New Deal reforms. The legislative record during Roosevelt's second term was meager. Aside from the minimum wage and a maximum hour law passed in 1938, Congress did not extend the New Deal into any new areas. Attempts to institute national health insurance was met with stubborn resistance, as did efforts by civil rights advocates to pass anti-lynching legislation. Disturbed by the growing congressional resistance, Roosevelt set out in the spring of 1938 to defeat a number of conservative Democratic congressmen and senators, primarily in the South. His targets gleefully charged the president with interference in local politics. Only one of the men he sought to defeat lost in the primaries. The failure of this attempt to purge further undermined Congress's. Oh my God! I'm so sorry. The failure of this attempted purge further undermined Roosevelt's strained relations with Congress. The worst blow came in the economic sector. The slow but steady improvement in the economy suddenly gave way to a sharp recession in the late summer of 1937. In the following 10 months, industrial production fell by 1/3, and nearly 4 million workers lost their jobs. Critics of the New Deal quickly labeled the downturn the Roosevelt recession, and the business executives claimed that it reflected a lack of confidence in FDR's leadership. Actually, FDR was at fault. In an effort to reduce expanding budget deficits, he cut back sharply on WPA and other government programs after the election. Federal contributions to consumer purchasing power fell from $4.1 billion in 1936 to less than $1 billion in 1937. For several months, Roosevelt refused to heed calls from economists to renew heavy government spending. Finally, in 1938, Roosevelt asked Congress for $3.75 billion of relief appropriation, and the economy began to revive. But FDR's premature attempt to balance the budget had meant 2 more years of hard times and had marred his reputation as the energetic foe of the Depression. The political result of the attempted purge and the recession was a strong Republican upsurge in the election of 1938. The GOP won an impressive 81 seats in the House and 8 more in the Senate, as well as 13 governorships. The party many thought dead suddenly had new life. The Democrats still held a sizable majority in Congress, but their margin in the House was particularly deceptive. There were 262 Democratic representatives to 169 Republicans, but 93 Southern Democrats held the balance of power. More and more often after 1938, anti-New Deal Southerners voted with Republican conservatives to block social and economic reform measures. Thus, not only was the New Deal over by the end of 1938, but a new bipartisan conservative coalition that would prevail for a quarter of the century had formed in Congress. Evaluation of the New Deal. The New Deal lasted a brief 5 years, and most of its measures came in two legislative bursts in the spring of 1933 and the summer of 1935. Yet its impact on American life was enduring. Nearly every aspect of economic, social, and political development in the decades that followed bore the imprints of Roosevelt's leadership. The least impressive achievement of the New Deal came in the economic realm. Whatever credit Roosevelt is given for relieving human suffering in the depths of the Depression must be balanced against his failure to achieve recovery in the 1930s. The moderate nature of his programs, especially the unwieldy NRA, led to slow and halting industrial recovery. Although much of the improvement that was made came as a result of government spending, FDR never embraced the concept of planned deficits, striving instead for a balanced budget. As a result, the nation had barely reached the 1929 level of production a year later, and there were still nearly 10 million people, men and women, unemployed. Equally important, Roosevelt refused to make any sweeping changes in the American economic system. Aside from the TVA, there were no broad experiments in regional planning and no attempts to alter free enterprise beyond imposing some limited reforms of government regulation. The New Deal did nothing to alter the basic distribution of wealth and power in the nation. The outcome was the preservation of the traditional capitalist system with a new overlay of federal control. More significant change occurred in American society. With the adoption of Social Security, the government acknowledged for the first time its responsibility to provide for the welfare of those unable to care for themselves in an industrial society. The Wagner Act helped stimulate the growth of labor unions to balance corporate power, and the minimum wage law provided a much-needed floor for American workers. Yet the New Deal tended to help only the more vocal and organized groups, such as union members and commercial farmers. Those without effective voices or political clout, African Americans, Mexican Americans, women, sharecroppers, restaurant laundry workers, received little help from the New Deal. For all the appealing rhetoric about the forgotten man, Roosevelt did little more than Hoover in responding to the long-term needs of the dispossessed. The most lasting impact of the Roosevelt leadership came in politics. Taking advantage on the emerging power of ethnic voters and capitalizing on frustration growing out of the Depression, FDR proved to be a genius at forging a new coalition. Overcoming the friction between rural and urban Democrats that had prolonged Republican supremacy in the 1920s, he attracted new groups to the Democratic Party, principally African Americans and organized labor. His political success led to a major realignment that lasted long after he left the scene. His political achievement also reveals the true nature of Roosevelt's success. He was a brilliant politician who recognized the essence of leadership in a democracy, appealing directly to the people and giving them a sense of purpose. He succeeded in infusing them with the same indomitable courage and jaunty optimism that had marked his own battle with polio. Thus, despite his limitations as a reformer, Roosevelt proved to be the leader of the American people needed in 1930s, a president who provided the psychological lift that helped them endure and survive the Great Depression. Well, that's it. There's some recommended reading, but I'm not going to read that. On page 784, there's a really, really good chart, which I would look into, because it says all of the agencies. I'm sorry for the 50 times I messed up, and I hope this works.